The first time they showed up at my door, I thought someone had died. Not because I still expected either of them to come back. I didn't. 5 years is long enough to understand the difference between grief and reality. But there are some faces your body remembers before your mind can protect you from them. When I opened the door that rainy Thursday evening and saw my ex-wife standing there beside the man who used to be my best friend, my chest locked so fast, I had to grip the edge of the doorframe just to keep my expression neutral. They looked older. That was my first thought. Not sadder, not wiser, not transformed by regret in some cinematic way. Just older. Like life had finally started charging interest. Mara stood half a step in front of him, the way she always used to when she wanted to control the temperature of a room before anyone else got to speak. Her coat was damp at the shoulders. Her mascara had blurred slightly under her eyes. Not enough to look messy. Just enough to signal strain. Behind her, Dean had both hands shoved into the pockets of a jacket that had once probably been expensive and now looked tired around the seams. There was a suitcase by their feet. A single suitcase. That detail mattered more than either of their faces. It meant this was not a social visit. It meant whatever had gone wrong had already gone wrong completely. For a few seconds, none of us said anything. Rain tapped against the porch railing. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and stopped. The porch light cast all three of us in that flat yellow kind of glow that makes every emotion look slightly unreal. Then Mara spoke first. "Elu," she said quietly. "We need help." There are moments in life so absurd your mind rejects them before your heart can even react. For one strange second, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the sentence itself felt broken. Like language had been used so badly, it no longer knew what it meant. "We need help from me." I looked at Dean. He didn't meet my eyes. That told me everything and nothing. 5 years earlier, he had looked me dead in the face and lied so smoothly. I remember thinking afterward that betrayal, real betrayal, doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives wearing the voice you trust most. Back then, if anyone had asked me what kind of man Dean was, I would have said loyal, reliable, the sort of friend who showed up with jumper cables at midnight and remembered your mother's birthday, the kind of man who stayed late after helping you move even when his own back was killing him, the kind of man who knew where all the weak beams in your life were and swore he was helping hold the roof up. That's the problem with certain betrayals. They are not committed by strangers. They are engineered by people who know exactly how much weight the structure can take before it collapses. Mara tried again. "Can we come in?" I should have said no. Maybe the strongest version of this story begins with me closing the door, locking it, and leaving them to drown in whatever storm they had manufactured for themselves. But strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is calm enough to gather evidence. So I stepped aside. Neither of them thanked me. That was interesting too. People who have truly fallen usually arrive stripped clean of arrogance. These two still carried traces of it. Even under the panic, not enough to feel powerful, just enough to remind me that whatever had brought them here, remorse probably wasn't leading it. My house was warm from the oven. I had chicken roasting with lemon and rosemary, a loaf of bread cooling on the rack, and an old jazz record playing low from the living room speaker. Thursday nights had become predictable in the best way. Work, groceries, a long shower, dinner at home. Stability is not glamorous when you're young. It is deeply attractive once life has dragged you by the throat a few times. Mara noticed the house first. Not the way someone admiringly takes in a room, The way someone recalculates another person's life in one sweep. The hardwood floors, the built-in shelves, the framed architectural sketches on the wall from a local artist I liked, the navy sofa, the quiet. Dean noticed the kitchen. Of course he did. He had always understood real comfort only when it belonged to someone else. I told them they could sit. I stayed standing. That mattered too. If you want to know who really holds power in a room, pay attention to who feels no need to collapse into furniture. Mara looked up at me and swallowed. You look well. I almost smiled. People always say that when what they mean is, I did not expect you to survive this attractively. I am. I said. Dean finally lifted his head. You've done well for yourself. There it was. The first probe. The first soft attempt to locate my resources before earning any access to my humanity. I said nothing. Silence makes desperate people reveal their script faster. Mara folded her hands in her lap, then unfolded them again. Her wedding ring was gone. That did not surprise me. What surprised me was the pale line still visible where it used to be. A ghost of a life she must have worn long enough for the skin to memorize. I leaned against the doorway and waited. At some point, when you have been betrayed deeply enough, you stop rushing to make other people comfortable in the scene they created. You let the quiet do some of the work. Finally, Dean cleared his throat. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't serious. I laughed once under my breath. Really? Mara looked pained. Ellie, please, just hear us out. That name still sounded strange in her mouth. Not because she said it wrong. Because there was a time my entire nervous system softened at the sound of her voice. And now every syllable from her felt like a notification from an old account I had already closed. I nodded toward the chairs. Talk. Dean looked at Mara. Mara looked at Dean. It was almost funny how quickly betrayal changes shape when the people who committed it start losing ground. 5 years earlier, they had presented a united front. Seamless. Certain. High on the righteousness of desire. Now each seemed to want the other to speak first. As if blame had become hot enough to burn through the container. Mara won. Or lost. Depending on how you see it. She spoke. Dean's business failed. I looked at him. He stiffened almost imperceptibly. So that was where the blood was in the water. Not all of it. Probably. But enough to smell it. What business? I asked. He frowned. You know, the contracting company. I did know he had one. Or tried to. Social media had made sure of that during the first year after they left. There had been photos, smiling pictures in matching coats, new office space, keys to a house, a dog they did not keep long, a caption once about betting on the right life. I remembered that one because I had stared at it in the middle of my half-empty apartment and understood. With a clarity so sharp, it almost helped. That some people need their cruelty witnessed to believe in it themselves. Mara kept talking. There were lawsuits, delays, a partner issue. Then the debt got bad. Bad enough. Dean said, not looking at me, that we lost the house? There it was. The suitcase suddenly made more sense. So did the damp shoulders, the wrong hour, the urgency. I crossed my arms. And Dean's jaw twitched. We need somewhere to stay. The old version of me would have felt the words first in my chest. This version of me felt them in my memory, On a mattress in my first apartment after they left. In the quiet of eating canned soup because I had spent too much on legal paperwork and moving costs. In the humiliation of calling my brother-in-law to help me haul boxes because I could not bring myself to ask anyone who had been at the barbecue where Dean put his hand on Mara's back, like I was already a ghost. Some injuries scar over, others become topography. You don't live inside the pain forever. But you never again walk across yourself without feeling where the ground broke. I asked, "Why would you think this was an option?" Mara's eyes filled immediately. She always cried faster than she reflected. "Because there's no one else?" That answer was so nakedly honest that for a second I almost respected it. Not because it was kind, because it was true. They were not here because they loved me, or missed me, or woke up ashamed after 5 years and finally found moral language. They were here because every other bridge had already burned. My house was not a homecoming. It was their last address. I asked how long they had known this was coming. Neither answered directly. Another answer. Long enough to plan. Long enough to avoid every other humiliation before arriving at mine. I looked from one to the other and saw, not for the first time, how time changes beauty when it has been supported by entitlement. Dean still had the broad shoulders and easy face that used to make people trust him instantly. But confidence sits differently on a man after failure has chased him into someone else's living room. Mara was still striking in the immediate way some women are. The kind that makes strangers stand up straighter when they enter a room. But the old precision in her had gone a little blunt around the edges. She looked like someone who had spent 5 years justifying choices that no longer paid dividends. I said, "No." Mara inhaled sharply, as if she had expected resistance, but not directness. Dean leaned forward. "Come on, man." That word, man, as if we were still standing side by side over beers on my old back deck, talking about mortgage rates and playoff predictions, and whether I was ready for kids. I felt something cold move through me. "Don't do that," I said. He frowned. "Do what?" "Speak to me like we're still friends." The room went quiet. "Good. Let it." Dean rubbed a hand over his mouth and looked away. Mara said softly, "We know we have no right to ask." "No." I said, "You know you need to ask? That's not the same thing." That landed. She lowered her eyes. I wish I could tell you there was some glorious cinematic satisfaction in that moment. There wasn't. Vindication rarely feels the way people imagine. It is quieter, less triumphant, more like finally hearing an old song in the correct key after years of listening to it played wrong. I walked to the kitchen and turned off the oven timer that had started beeping. Neither followed. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the room. Suddenly too domestic for the scene unfolding inside it. I plated my dinner anyway. That also mattered. Not as a performance, as a reminder. My life no longer paused because theirs had fallen apart. When I returned to the dining table with my plate, Mara looked almost offended. "You're eating?" I sat down. "Yes." Dean stared at me. "You can't be serious." I cut into the chicken and looked at him evenly. "You came to my house uninvited at dinner time asking for shelter after sleeping with my wife and helping destroy my life. Sirius left this room a while ago." Mara flinched. "Good. Some truths deserve furniture." Dean leaned back hard in the chair. Anger surfacing now that shame had failed to open any doors. It was 5 years ago. That sentence told me more about his character than the affair ever had. People who create devastation and survive it without consequences often mistake elapsed time for forgiveness. I said, "For you?" He opened his mouth. Mara cut in first. "We're not saying what happened wasn't awful." "No." I said, "You're saying it expired?" She went quiet. I ate another bite of chicken. Outside. Rain slid down the window in thin silver threads. Inside. The three of us sat around my dining table like witnesses to three different realities. Theirs, a hard season. Complicated choices. Unfortunate collapse. Mine, betrayal. Humiliation. Abandonnement. And 5 years of rebuilding without the dignity of even being hated honestly. Because here is the thing people do not say often enough. Infidelity is not just sex. And betrayal is not just leaving. It is the theft of context. The sudden rewriting of your past by two people who smile at you while planning the version of your future that does not include them. Mara and I had been married for 6 years when it happened. Not the kind of marriage people write poems about. Not a disaster either. We were ordinary in the way most real marriages are ordinary. Shared calendars. Costco runs. Fights about money that weren't really about money. Sunday laundry. One bathroom drawer that somehow filled with all the things neither of us wanted to claim. The small habits of a life that only look precious after someone smashes them. If you had asked me then whether I was happy, I would have said mostly, that's another thing betrayal feeds on. Not perfect marriages. Functional ones. The routines dull your suspicion. The history gives cover. The trust turns every future lie into borrowed access. Dean had been in my life longer than Mara had. We met at 19 in community college. Both of us broke and pretending we were only there temporarily before our real lives started. He was the kind of person who talked easily to everyone and somehow made it feel specific. We became friends because he loaned me a wrench set the week my truck died, and I never really stopped knowing him after that. He stood beside me at my wedding. That sentence still has no texture I can tolerate. He stood beside me while I married the woman who would later leave me for him. If you want to know how thoroughly a person can destroy your faith in your own judgment, start there. Mara and I met at a friend's engagement party. She laughed at one of my jokes. Not politely. Really laughed. Head tipped back. Hand at her collarbone. Eyes bright. I remember noticing that first, then the way she asked questions that made people feel like they had become slightly more interesting just by answering them. She had that gift. The kind that looks like attentiveness, but is often something closer to selection. When she chose you, it felt flattering. By the end, I understood it was often strategic. Still, I loved her, deeply, earnestly. In the uncomplicated way people love before they learn that devotion without accuracy becomes self-endangerment. Our first years were good. Small apartment. Tight money. Big plans. She worked in marketing. I was moving up slowly in commercial design. Doing CAD drafts. Site planning support. Whatever got me closer to licensed work and better pay. We rented a duplex with terrible insulation and a backyard too small for the dog we kept promising to adopt. We hosted game nights. Dean came over often. That sentence used to make my stomach turn. By then, it mostly made me tired. He knew the code to our garage. He knew where we kept the spare wine glasses. He knew Mara hated olives and loved expensive candles and got quiet when she was angry instead of loud. He knew too much because I trusted him enough to let him. That is what people never understand when they say, "You should have seen it." Seen what? A hand on the shoulder that lasted a second too long at a barbecue? A look across a room between two people who had known each other for years through me? The problem is not that signs never exist. It is that trust teaches you to file them under impossible. Looking back, there were things. Dean texting Mara directly about plans that involved me. Mara defending him with extra sharpness any time I got irritated by something small. The two of them occasionally sharing a joke that clearly had a history I wasn't present for. But life is full of partial evidence. When you love people, you explain in their favor until the pattern becomes too large to fit inside denial. The truth came out in the ugliest possible way. Not because I caught them in bed. Life is rarely that neat. It came out because Mara forgot to log out of her email on our shared laptop. And I sat down one Saturday morning to send a client invoice for a side drafting job and saw a message thread open under her name. The subject line was blank. That is what I remember most. No dramatic headline. No obvious confession. Just an ordinary open window. And then one line near the bottom that split my life clean down the center. I can't keep pretending in front of him much longer. I read the line 5 times before my brain attached meaning to it. Then I scrolled and scrolled and kept scrolling until language itself started feeling poisonous. There were messages between them, stretching back almost 9 months. 9 months. Inside those months were lunches, I thought, were work meetings, late projects, girls' weekends, checking in on Dean because he was struggling. There were jokes about me. Not brutal jokes. Worse. Casualones. Administrative ones. The kind that reduce a person to an obstacle while still enjoying his labor. There were messages about my habits. How early I woke up. How predictable I was. How guilty Mara felt, some days. How Dean thought the timing would work out if they waited until after our anniversary trip I had already paid for. That part hurt more than the sex. The management of me. The scheduling. The confidence. I do not remember sitting down. But I must have, because when Mara walked in from the grocery store 20 minutes later, I was at the kitchen table, still staring at the screen, with my hands flat against the wood like I was trying to stop the room from moving. She saw the laptop. Then she saw my face. And all the blood drained from hers in 1 second. That was the moment. Not the emails. Not the affair. That exact second. When the truth entered the room, and neither of us could pretend it had the wrong address. She set the grocery bags down so slowly it almost looked careful. Elu. I remember lifting my hand. Not in anger. To stop the sound. I could not bear hearing my own name in the mouth that had spent 9 months making me a logistical problem. I asked one question. How long? She said nothing for maybe 3 seconds. Then, it's complicated. I laughed. Actually laughed. Because betrayal always reveals itself first, through cowardly vocabulary. Complicated. A word people use when they want emotional credit for a mess they built one selfish choice at a time. I asked again. How long? 9 months. There it was. Plain now. Ugly enough to breathe. I nodded once, staring at the grain of the table because if I looked at her too long, I thought I might either break something or beg for a version of reality that no longer existed. Neither option appealed to me. Does Dean know I know? She whispered. Not yet. I stood up then, walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, turned it off again. Little motions, mechanical, my body looking for tasks because the mind inside it was on fire. And then I said the sentence that would later embarrass me by its innocence. Why? Not because I believed there was a good answer. Because the human mind is stupid enough to think pain becomes survivable when explained properly. Mara cried then, quietly, efficiently, like someone opening the correct drawer for the appropriate emotion. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen. She said she felt unseen. She said Dean understood parts of her I no longer seemed curious about. She said we had grown apart. All the usual furniture people drag into the room after they have set it on fire. I remember listening and thinking, none of this is about why. It's about permission. You found each other useful and then moralized the appetite. I asked if she loved him. That one, she answered faster. Yes. That hurt in a cleaner way. At least it was sharp. At least it did not ask to be called nuanced. I told her to leave. She asked if we could talk later. After emotions settled. That line too. As if there remained some version of the day that was recoverable through scheduling. I told her to leave. She went upstairs to pack a bag. And while she was doing that, I did something I still thank God for. I called Dean. Not because I wanted answers. Because I wanted his voice on record before he could reconstruct himself as a victim of difficult feelings. He answered on the second ring. Cheerful at first. Then he heard my silence. Then he knew. That silence between us is one of the most violent sounds I have ever heard. He tried denial for about 8 seconds. Then partial confession. Then, I never meant to hurt you. That phrase nearly split my skull. As though intention were somehow the deciding moral variable after 9 months of deceit. I told him never to come back to my house. I told him if he wanted her, he could collect all of it. The suitcases, the wreckage, the explanation to our friends, the version of himself that would need mirrors covered for a while. Then I hung up. By that night, she was gone. By the next week, everyone knew. Not the truth. Version. That's how betrayal travels socially. The person injured becomes a source. The people who caused the injury become narrators. I heard later that Mara told some people our marriage had been over for a long time. Dean apparently said he and I had grown apart years earlier. Which was impressive considering he had been drinking my beer on my patio 2 weeks before. Some friends disappeared immediately. Those are the easy losses. Others tried to stay neutral. Neutrality is a luxury for people not standing in the blast radius. A few stayed close, quietly, imperfectly. Enough. My sister called every night for a week. My father, who had never been especially emotional. I drove 2 hours just to help me change the locks and say almost nothing while doing it. There are men who apologize with words, and men who apologize for all the times they didn't know how to love you by showing up with tools. He was the second kind. I appreciated both. But what I remember most from that first month is not rage. It is humiliation. Humiliation is the understory of betrayal. No one wants to discuss because it sounds weaker than anger. It isn't. It is more corrosive. It's one thing to lose a marriage, another to lose it publicly, to the man everyone saw laughing in your backyard with a drink in his hand. Another still to realize your private life was probably a conversation in rooms you weren't in. I stopped going places for a while. The grocery store felt dangerous. Restaurants felt worse. Every familiar place had become a stage where I might run into someone wearing either pity or curiosity. So I worked. Then worked more. Then went home to the rental house we had once planned to buy together and sat in rooms that still smelled faintly like her shampoo, and the cedar candle Dean once brought over as a joke housewarming gift before we even owned the place. That first year did not break me all at once. It eroded me. Slowly. Bank accounts had to be separated. The divorce was not dramatic, but it was ugly in the administrative way that forces you to relive betrayal through spreadsheets. Furniture got divided. Debts got assigned. There was an argument over the dining table, which I let go, because at some point a man has to decide whether he is fighting for wood or dignity. I kept the truck. I kept my tools. I kept the silence. They got the story they wanted for a while. They moved in together within months. People posted photos. Smiles. Sunlight. Gatherings. A kind of forced radiance that looked persuasive from far away and desperate from close up. I saw enough to understand the outline. Then I stopped looking. That was the beginning of surviving properly. Not healing. Survival. A different thing. Healing has music under it. Survival is mostly repetition. Wake up. Work. Lift weights. Eat. Pay bills. Sleep badly. Repeat. Then, one Tuesday, 6 months after she left, something small happened that changed the direction of my life. My boss asked me why I was still doing design support work when I clearly had the technical and client skills to move into project management. I remember almost laughing because grief makes ambition feel embarrassing. He kept talking. He said I was steadier than most people in the office, better with clients, better under pressure, more organized than the men already being trusted with larger accounts. Steady. That word stayed with me. Because in my marriage, in my friendships, in the story Dean and Mara built out of me, steadiness had been treated like boredom, predictability, safety with no thrill. But in the real world, away from appetite and ego and fantasy, steadiness was valuable, bankable, promotable, buildable. That conversation led to night classes, certification, longer hours, a new position the following year, then another. Then a small townhouse I rented alone in a neighborhood with tree-lined streets, and the kind of quiet that sounds expensive because it is. I got up earlier, cooked more, drank less, stopped accepting invitations from people who wanted gossip more than they wanted me. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I realized something almost offensive in its simplicity. The life they destroyed had not actually been the best life available to me. That did not make what they did acceptable. It made it survivable. There is a difference. By year 3, my income had doubled from where it was when Mara left. By year 4, I had made partner track on a commercial development team I never would have reached if my old life had continued in its sleepy shape. By year 5, I had savings, equity, a reputation for competence, and a house with a front porch no one helped me buy and no one could use as a stage for my humiliation. I was not happy all at once. I was dignified first. That came before happiness. That came before dating again, which I did slowly and badly, and then a little better. It came before trust, which returned in fractions. It came before laughter that wasn't defensive, before music in the kitchen, before hosting people again. It came when I understood I did not need to prove I was lovable by surviving people who treated me like collateral damage. And now, 5 years later, the 2 architects of that collapse were sitting in my dining room asking to be rescued from the life they built from my ruins. I set down my fork. The chicken had gone a little cold. Mara looked exhausted now. The effort of maintaining poise slipping. Dean looked angry in that desperate masculine way that is really just fear wearing shoulder width. I asked one question. What happened between you two? Not because it mattered morally, because collapse always tells the truth faster than romance does. Mara pressed her lips together. Dean spoke first. Life happened. I smiled without warmth. No, specifics happened. He looked away. Mara said, It got hard. I nearly laughed. Of course it did. Affairs are often financed by stolen context. Secret time. Selective truth. Fantasy operating on credit. Then ordinary life arrives with invoices. Mortgage payments. Business losses. Sickness. Fatigue. Resentment. Laundry. And suddenly the grand passion that once justified treachery has to survive Tuesday mornings and tax debt. Most of them don't. Not for long. Dean ran a hand through his hair. There were cash flow issues. Clients stopped paying. Then the lawsuits hit. The house got behind. We tried to sell. It was too late. Marta added. And then the bank froze everything. That was useful. A financial choke point. The sort of pressure that forces people to inventory all remaining pride and decide what can be traded for breathing room. Apparently tonight they had chosen mine. I looked at the suitcase again. Then at the rain. Then back at them. No, I said. This time, I said it gently. That made it stronger. Dean pushed back from the table. So that's it? I held his gaze. Yes. Mara stared at me. Eyes bright now with some mix of panic and disbelief. You would really leave us with nowhere to go? I let the question sit for a second before answering. No, I said. Life did that. I'm just refusing to interrupt it. Neither of them spoke. And that was when I knew part one of the story had ended. Not 5 years ago. Now, because the moment people who abandoned you return needing the exact stability they once mocked, the past stops being an injury and becomes a test. And I already knew my answer. For a moment, none of us moved. Rain kept tapping the windows. The record had ended. So the room was sitting inside that flat. Honest silence. You only notice when everyone in it is waiting for someone else to break first. Dean stood by the chair like he couldn't decide whether to leave or fight. Mara stayed seated. But only barely. Her whole body looked pitched forward. Like if hope cracked 1 inch more, she would fall out of it completely. I had expected anger from them. Maybe even pleading. What I had not expected was how quickly the room began to smell like old power dying. Because that was what this really was. Not a housing crisis. Not bad timing. Not two people fallen on hard times. It was the collapse of a story they had told themselves for 5 years. That they were the brave ones. That they had chosen passion over stagnation. That I had been the safe, dull version of life, and they had been bold enough to reach for something real. Now they were sitting in my dining room in wet coats with one suitcase between them. While my dinner cooled beside my hand and my mortgage was paid. Life has a sense of humor, so dry it almost counts as theology. Mara looked up first. So you're really not going to help us? I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. I am helping. I said, I'm being honest. Her face tightened. That's not help. It's the only kind you've earned from me. Dean barked out a bitter laugh. Earned. I turned toward him. Yes, I said. That word exists, even if it hasn't visited your life much lately. That landed harder than I expected. He stepped back like I had physically shoved him. Good. Some men mistake years without accountability for proof of innocence. They become offended when truth arrives in a full sentence. He crossed his arms. You think you're better than us now? I almost smiled. Now, that was the key word. As if morality had only just entered the room because their lives had collapsed and mine had not. I said, that you are standing in my house asking for mercy from the man you humiliated? And you still haven't apologized. Dean's mouth opened, then shut. Mara said softly, We said we know we had no right to ask. That's not an apology. She looked away. I waited. No one spoke. Because people like them always want acknowledgement to cost less than repair. They want you to be moved by the outline of remorse without forcing them to step fully into it. They want the emotional discount without paying the actual bill. Finally, Dean muttered, I'm sorry it happened the way it did. I laughed. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just enough to honor the insult. The way it did. I repeated. Interesting phrasing. He glared. Mara whispered. Din. No. I said, let him talk. I want to hear what accountability sounds like when he's this close to sleeping in his car. That changed the room. Not because I raised my voice. Because I said the one thing none of them wanted named. Need is easier to carry when it stays abstract. Dean's nostrils flared. Fine, he said. I'm sorry. For what? His jaw clenched. I let the silence lengthen. He looked at Mara. Like maybe she would rescue him one more time. She didn't. Not because she had changed. Because she couldn't afford to. At last he said, for what happened between us? Weak, vague, defensive. I shook my head. No. He stared at me. No? No. Try again. Mara closed her eyes for a second. I could almost hear her calculating whether humiliation would unlock the door faster than charm. But charm needs leverage. And by then the only leverage left in the room was truth. Dean said, more quietly, I'm sorry for lying to you. Better. Still incomplete. I waited. He swallowed. And for being with your wife? I tilted my head. While pretending to be my friend, he looked down. Yes. There it was. The first real thing he had said since stepping through my door. It did not heal anything, but it made the air more accurate. I turned to Mara. She straightened slightly, like some old reflex still wanted to preserve dignity through posture. What about you? Her eyes filled again. But this time, the tears came slower, less rehearsed. I'm sorry, she said. For betraying you? For lying to you? For making you feel like your whole marriage was something stupid. That one hit deeper than I expected. Because it was specific. Because it touched the humiliation instead of orbiting it. I said nothing. She kept going. I told myself we were already broken. That I was just being honest about what I wanted. But that wasn't true. I was a coward. Both of us were. Dean stiffened at that, but didn't interrupt. Interesting. Maybe collapse had done what conscience never could. Mara looked around the room as though she could see my life more clearly, now that she had been forced to enter it from below. I thought we were choosing something bigger, she said. Something more alive. That's what I told myself. But really, I just didn't want to be the bad person in my own story. That was true too. And truth, when it finally arrives, rarely flatters anyone. I leaned back in my chair. Why now? I asked. Mara blinked. What? Why apologize now? Why not 3 years ago? Why not 1 year ago? Why not when you still had the house? The money. The image. The posts. The weekends away. The version of yourselves that looked like a reward for what you did? Her face collapsed inward a little. Dean answered this time. Because then we could still pretend it had worked. That was the most honest sentence of the night. It almost made me pity him. Almost. I stood and carried my plate to the sink again. More out of instinct than hunger. My hands needed motion, while my mind sorted through the old architecture of pain opening and closing under each sentence. When I turned back, Mara was looking at the framed photograph on the sideboard. Not of her. Not of us. It was just me and my father standing beside the fishing boat we'd rented 2 summers earlier. Both sunburned. Both smiling in that awkward, surprised way men do when they realize they're actually enjoying each other. Her gaze lingered there. You and your dad are close again? Closer. I said. She nodded slowly. As if the idea that my life had continued building after her departure still offended some deeper assumption she had once relied on. That was part of the insult too. Back then. Not just that she left. That both of them assumed my story had ended when theirs began. People who betray you often imagine themselves as the center of causality. As if your life only acquires weather through them. Watching them sit in my house, surrounded by proof that I had gone on without them, was, in its own quiet way, more satisfying than rage. Dean rubbed at the back of his neck. We really don't have anywhere. I believed him. That was the problem with consequences. They do not stop being real, just because the people experiencing them deserve them. I looked at the suitcase again. Scuffed handle. 1 broken zipper pull. Cheap replacement wheels. Not the luggage of people who had planned well. Where have you been staying? I asked. Mara answered. A motel for 4 nights? Before that, with Dean's cousin, that ended badly. I did not ask why. Some details explain themselves. And your parents? I asked Mara. She laughed once. Bitter. Tired. My mother said I made my choices. I raised an eyebrow. That must have been educational. She almost smiled. Almost. Then the expression disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Dean said, Look, we're not asking forever. Just a few weeks. Until I get something lined up. That was the first truly dangerous sentence of the night. Not because of what it asked. Because of how familiar it sounded. Just a few weeks. Just a little help. Just until things stabilize. That is how certain people cross every line of your life. Not in one large invasion. In manageable installments. Small exceptions that accumulate into captivity. I knew that now. And because I knew it, my answer stayed clean. No. Mara closed her eyes. Dean cursed under his breath. Then he looked at me with that old hard anger rising again. You'd really let us drown. I met his starry. You let me. His face changed. Not softened. Not humbled. Just stripped. Because that was the sentence neither of them had ever truly sat with. Not the affair. Not the divorce. Not the humiliation. The abandonment. How thorough it had been. How efficiently they had moved on while I was still trying to understand what shape my own life had become without warning. Mara whispered. We didn't think. I know. I said. And I did know. That was the whole point. They had not thought. Not deeply. Not morally. Not beyond their appetite and their narrative. They had mistaken wanting something for a defense of taking it. The rain outside had eased now into a soft, steady mist. The porch light cast a dull halo through the glass near the front door. It was getting late. I checked the time. That movement seemed to panic Mara more than anything else. Please, she said, don't send us out like this. There are sentences that reach directly into the oldest parts of you. That one did. Not because of love. Because I was raised to respond to fear faster than I responded to myself. For one brief, dangerous second, I imagined saying yes. Not forever. Not even long. Just tonight. Let them sleep in the guest room. Let the storm pass. Figure it out tomorrow. And in that second I saw, with awful clarity, exactly how some cycles reopen. Not through grand weakness. Through one merciful exception made by the person trained to carry more than everyone else. I steadied myself. Then I said, I'm not taking you in, but I'll book 2 nights at a hotel. They both stared. Dean said, What? You heard me. Mara's face shifted from panic to confusion. I continued before they could speak over me. I will pay for 2 nights at a decent hotel. 2 rooms. Not 1. I will also pay for 1 consultation with an employment attorney if the business collapse involves personal liability. And 1 meeting with a financial counselor who can tell you what reality looks like from here. That is the sum total of my help. Dean actually laughed. You're kidding. No. That's nothing. I looked at him and felt something inside me settle into stone. No. I said, that is structure. It is also more than you gave me. Mara whispered. 2 rooms? Yes. She blinked. You think we should separate? I think that is your business. I said, but since you're asking for my money, I'm not funding the performance of a partnership you can't afford. That landed harder than I intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as it needed to. Dean shoved his chair back with a scrape. This is unbelievable. I stood too. No. Unbelievable was opening my life to my best friend and my wife, and finding out I had been converted into a scheduling problem in both your phones. He stared at me. Mara went still. Good. Let them remember that I knew. Not just the fact of what they did, the texture of it, the management, the smugness. Dean muttered. You really never let any of it go. I laughed once. That's rich coming from a man who brought a suitcase to my door. He looked like he wanted to hit something. Maybe me. Maybe the wall. Maybe time itself for not bending backward forever to protect him from his own patterns. Instead, he turned away and walked toward the window, both hands on his hips. Mara stayed seated, eyes on me, and in a voice so small I almost missed it. She said, "Did you ever hate me?" The question was so naked it changed the room again. Not because it mattered practically, because it was the first question all night that wasn't about shelter or money or logistics. It was a human question. Late, self-serving, but human. I answered honestly, "Yes." She looked down. For a long time. I said, "I hated both of you. Then I hated myself. Then I got tired." The house was quiet enough to hear Dean breathing by the window. I went on. "And then one day I realized hatred still made my life about what you did instead of what I was building. So I stopped feeding it." Mara's eyes filled again. "Did you forgive us?" There it was. The question wounded people are always asked by the ones who did the wounding. As if forgiveness were the final certificate, proving everybody can move on with clean records. I shook my head. "Not in the way you mean." She frowned slightly. "I don't wake up every day angry." I said, "I don't fantasize about your suffering. I don't organize my life around your collapse. But forgiveness doesn't mean access. It doesn't mean trust. And it definitely doesn't mean a spare key." Something about that almost made Dean laugh despite himself. But the sound died in his throat. "Good. Let there be no easy release." Mara sat with that answer for a moment. Then she nodded once. As if some part of her had expected this all along, and only now accepted that expectation as reality. Dean turned back from the window. "So that's your final answer?" "Yes." He stared at me for a long second. Then he said, "You know, for a while after it all happened, I told myself you'd be better off, that you were too steady for her, that she needed something else and you'd be happier without her. I actually believed I did you some kind of favor." I felt my body go very still. That sentence, of all the awful things I had imagined hearing from him over the years, that one might have been the worst. Not because it shocked me, because I knew enough about him to believe it. Self-justification so complete it dressed up theft as generosity. I took one step toward him. "Listen to me carefully." I said, "The best thing either of you ever did for me was leave. But that does not turn betrayal into a gift. It means I was strong enough to turn damage into a life. Don't ever confuse those things again." He held my gaze for maybe 2 seconds. Then he looked away. Mara whispered, "He deserved to hear that." Dean said nothing. I walked to the coat closet, pulled out 2 umbrellas, and set them by the door. Then I took my phone from my pocket. "There's a hotel 12 minutes from here." I said, "I'm booking the rooms now." Mara rose slowly. Dean did not thank me. Neither did she. At first, they just stood there while I tapped through the reservation screen. Their whole future reduced, for this particular night, to confirmation numbers and checkout times. Funny. What power looks like in middle age. Not fists. Not speeches. A calm hand entering card details, while the people who once rewrote your life wait quietly for terms. When I was done, I texted Mara the booking info. "Front desk has your names." I said, "Checkout is Saturday at 11. After that, you figure out the rest yourselves." Dean let out a slow breath through his nose. You always did like rules. I smiled faintly. No. I learned to like not being destroyed by other people's lack of them. That shut him up. At the door, Mara hesitated. The suitcase stood between them like a third exhausted witness. She looked at my face as if trying to memorize the version of me that had emerged without her permission. Then she said, "You really built all this?" Not a question. En observation? The house, the life, the posture, the fact that I could stand 3 feet from the two people who once hollowed me out and not reach for either revenge or rescue. Yes, I said. She nodded again. And this time, finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry. Elle. Not polished. Not sufficient. But real enough that I believe she meant it." I held the door open. "I know," I said. Dean stopped on the porch and half turned back. For a second, I thought he might say something honest. Instead, he said, "You got lucky." I almost laughed. There it was. The oldest religion of weak men. If another person survives what they destroyed, call it luck? Never discipline. Never labor. Never years of rebuilding without witnesses. Just luck. I looked him in the eye and said, "No." I got up. Then I closed the door. I stood there for a moment with my hand still on the lock. I could hear the rain again. Softer now. The muted roll of suitcase wheels down the porch steps. A car starting. Then nothing. Just my own house. My own breathing. The low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It is amazing how wholly ordinary silence can feel after the past finally leaves your front porch under its own weight. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was torn. Because adrenaline has a delayed fuse. I cleaned the kitchen. Wrapped the leftover chicken. Turned off the porch light. Then I sat in the living room with a glass of water and let the old years move through me one by one. The first apartment after Mara left. The nights I fell asleep on the couch because the bedroom felt too accusatory. The divorce papers. The awkward pity in other people's faces. The first promotion. The first decent bonus. The first morning I woke up in this house and realized peace no longer felt temporary. All of it. Loss in architecture. Wreckage in carpentry. By 2 a.m, I understood something I had not fully named before. They had not come back because I was still theirs. They had come back because, deep down, even they knew I had always been the stable one. Not exciting. Not dramatic. Stable. The quality they once treated as lack had turned out to be the only thing in the story that lasted. The next afternoon, Mara texted, "Thank you for the hotel." I stared at the message for a while. Then she sent another. "He left this morning. We argued half the night. I think this is really over now." I read that one twice. Not because it mattered romantically. That ended for me years ago. Because collapse is sometimes most honest in the final separation. When the shared fantasy finally loses its funding, I did not answer immediately. An hour later I wrote, "I hope you make better choices when there's no one left to blame." She responded with a single word. Fair. Dean never texted. He emailed 3 days later. Subject line, nothing dramatic. Inside was a message shorter than I expected. He said he had found temporary work with a developer outside the city. He said he knew I did not owe him anything. He said he had spent years telling himself he had won something when all he had really done was prove he would take what he wanted if it was close enough and familiar enough. Then one line stood out. "You were the better man long before this ended. I just didn't know how much that would cost me." I read it once, then archived it. Not because it didn't matter, because some acknowledgments arrived too late to become conversation. Weeks passed. Life resumed. That was the strangest part. No thunderclap, no great emotional release. Just ordinary mornings returning on schedule, which is how real healing usually looks. I went to work, reviewed site plans, argued with a contractor about drainage, bought groceries, mowed the lawn, answered my sister's call on Sunday, and listened to her rant about her teenage son's haircut. Life. Gloriously indifferent to old drama once you stop building altars for it. Then, about a month later, Iranin tomara alone. Saturday morning. Farmer's market. I was buying peaches. She was standing near the flower stalls in a denim jacket. Hair tied back. No makeup. Holding a paper cup of coffee, like she had forgotten she was supposed to drink it. She saw me first. You can always tell by the way a person's shoulders gather when memory reaches them before language does. I expected awkwardness. Maybe apology. What I got was almost stranger. Relief. She walked over slowly. "Hi." "Hi." We stood there among buckets of sunflowers and heirloom tomatoes, like two people from adjacent lifetimes. She looked thinner, softer around the eyes, less arranged. Maybe that was what truth did when it had enough time. "I found an apartment," she said. I nodded. "That's good. I got a new job too." "Good." She smiled faintly. "You always did keep conversations efficient." I almost smiled back. "Only when needed." There was a pause. Then she said, "I meant what I said. At your house?" "I know." She looked down at her coffee. "I used to think being chosen meant I was winning." That was an interesting sentence. I waited. She went on. "But all I really did was confuse being wanted with being safe, and I confused excitement with character." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "Most people learn that after a bad year. You took longer." She let out a short laugh. And for the first time in maybe 10 years, it sounded like an actual reaction instead of a social instrument. "I deserved that," she said. Maybe she did. Maybe what she deserved more was the simple discomfort of hearing one accurate sentence without the world ending afterward. She glanced up. "Do you think we'll ever be not this?" I considered the question carefully. Not because I owed her optimism, because precision mattered. "We'll never be what we were." I said, "And I don't want that. But we don't have to be enemies." She nodded slowly. That seemed to hurt her a little. "Good. Not out of cruelty. Because some grief deserves the dignity of remaining proportionate." We said goodbye. And that was that. Dean, I saw only once more. About a year later at an industry event. He was across the room near the bar, talking to a developer I knew. Older. Leaner. Less sure of where to put his hands. He saw me. Hesitated. Then came over. I braced myself for something awkward. Instead, he stuck out his hand. I looked at it, then at him. He lowered it with a half smile that admitted the mistake. Fair, he said. At least he was learning. He told me he was sober now. That got my attention. Not because it explained everything. It didn't. But because collapse often reveals which parts of a person were choices and which were coping mechanisms pretending to be personality. He said he was renting a small place, working steadily, trying not to turn every setback into proof that someone else had failed him. That line almost made me laugh. He noticed. I know, he said. That would have been useful earlier. Yes, I said. It would have. He nodded. Then he said something I did not expect. I was jealous of you before any of it happened. I said nothing. He continued. You had a life that fit, not flashy, but solid. Mara admired that, even when she was restless. And I think part of me wanted to see if I could take something from the center of it and still feel like I mattered. There it was. Not romance. Not destiny. Not irresistible connection. Envy with access. Human ugliness usually sounds a lot less poetic when it's finally sober. I said. And did it work? He looked around the room, then back at me. No. That was enough for me. Not absolution. Just enough truth to stop the past from needing further excavation. Years moved on. That is the last part nobody believes when they're in the middle of betrayal. That life does not merely continue. It evolves. Not neatly. Not fairly. But completely. 2 years after they showed up at my door, I got engaged. Her name was Nora. She was a civil engineer with a wicked, dry sense of humor and the kind of emotional steadiness that feels almost suspicious until you realize it is just what health looks like after enough chaos. She asked direct questions. Liked clean countertops. Read contracts carefully. Did not romanticize damage. The first time I told her the full story about Mara and Dean, she listened without interrupting and then said, "That must have changed the way you define safety." I knew then I was dealing with a different caliber of person. Not because she pitied me, because she understood the structure of the wound. We built slowly. On purpose. No grand declarations. No emotional fireworks mistaken for depth. Just consistency. Mutuality. 1,000 small, honest things. The first time Nora came to the house, she stood in the kitchen, looked around, and said, "This place feels like it was built by someone who wanted calm more than impression." I laughed because she was exactly right. And because, for the first time, someone saw the life I had built without filtering it through what it lacked. We married in a small ceremony under oak trees behind her aunt's house. No spectacle. No theater. Just people who knew the difference between witness and audience. My father cried, which startled everyone, including him. My sister gave a speech too long and too heartfelt and ended by saying, "Eli used to think being decent meant letting people take more than they should. He doesn't anymore. Thank God." Nora squeezed my hand under the table. That was one of the happiest moments of my life. Not because it erased the past, because it proved the past had not kept its original promises about my future. Mara sent a card. Simple, appropriate, no emotional trespassing. Dean sent nothing. Also appropriate. By then, my life no longer measured itself against either absence That is when you know you're free. Not when you stop hurting. When the old reference points lose their authority. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Nora will ask whether I ever regret letting them go that night, with only a hotel booking and a list of numbers. The answer is always no. Not because I am hard, because I finally learned the difference between compassion and self-betrayal. Compassion says, I can acknowledge your humanity without volunteering my home as a monument to my own erasure. Compassion says, I can offer limited help without reopening the wound that made such help necessary in the first place. Compassion says, your emergency does not automatically become my assignment. That lesson cost me a marriage, a friendship, half a decade, and more humiliation than I could have imagined surviving at 34. But I did survive it. More than that, I outgrew the version of myself that thought endurance was the same thing as love. That was the real revenge. Not their failure. Not the suitcase. Not the rain on the porch. Not even the moment they had to ask me for help and hear terms instead of rescue. The real revenge was this. They left me for a life built on appetite, ego, and fantasy. I built mine on discipline, clarity, and peace. Guess which one lasted? If this story has a lesson, it is not that cheaters always lose, or that karma arrives on schedule with signed paperwork and poetic timing. Sometimes they land well. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes life punishes them. Sometimes life merely reveals them. The point is not what happens to them. It is what happens to you after you stop making your future kneel before your pain. My wife left me for my best friend. 5 years later, they both showed up at my doorstep asking for help. I did help, just not in the way they expected. I gave them enough to survive the night, not enough to move back into my life. And that, I have learned, is what boundaries look like when they stop apologizing for existing. I do not hate them now. That would require an intimacy with the past I no longer maintain. I remember them accurately. That is enough. Mara taught me that being chosen is meaningless if the chooser has no character. Dean taught me that loyalty is not proven by history. It is proven by restraint when temptation has a face and your name on it. And the man I became after both of them taught me something neither of them ever intended. A stable life is not boring. A peaceful home is not small. A decent man is not weak. And the person who gets left behind is not always the one who loses. Sometimes he is just the one forced, finally, to build something real. That rainy Thursday night, after I closed the door and heard their suitcase wheels fade into the dark, I thought the main thing I felt was relief. I was wrong. It took years to name it properly. What I felt was completion. Not because the wound vanished. Because the story had finally stopped asking me to be the one who bled for everyone else's choices. And once that happened, everything that came after belonged entirely to me.